All right, so now we've come to our last slide or last dimension, excuse me, for Islam, which is that of society. So for this slide, we're just going to talk a little bit more about the two main branches of Islam, which are the Sunni and the Shia. So we already talked about the dispute that led to the initial split between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, and it had to do with the successor of Muhammad. That after Muhammad died, there was a question of who would lead the Muslim community. And remember that Muhammad was both the religious as well as the social and political leader of the early Muslim community because they set up an independent community in Medina when they left Mecca, and when they returned to Mecca, they started an empire. Right? They started a Muslim empire that grew very quickly. So there needed to be some sort of leadership role after Muhammad died. The Sunni Muslims were the ones who supported Abu Bakr, and Shia Muslims were the ones who supported Ali. So first, for Sunni Islam, the reason that they supported Abu Bakr was because he was very respected in the community. He was already very high up within the community, and already had a lot of responsibility in terms of running the Muslim community. He was already kind of Muhammad's right hand man. So they thought he was a natural leader. And what's important to note about Abu Bakr and about Sunni Islam is that they really viewed Muhammad as unique in that he was the prophet, so it was possible for him to unite the roles of religious leader and social political leader. But after Muhammad was gone, they thought it was best to separate those two roles. So after Muhammad, no one should have really sole religious and political authority. That we should separate those two roles into two individuals or groups of individuals. And they believed that the political leader should be somebody voted on or agreed upon by the consensus. It wasn't necessarily always a vote, but the community should decide who the political leader is. So they separated their leadership positions into the two terms that I have here. Their political leader was called the caliph, and their religious leader is called the imam. So Abu Bakr was the first caliph. So they did believe that there still needed to be sort of one leader of the Muslim community, but that person would focus on social and political concerns. They would be like a ruler, somebody who dealt in those affairs, but not necessarily the religious or spiritual leader of the Muslims. So Abu Bakr was the first caliph. And there was, you may have also heard the noun form, which is the caliphate, or the institution of the caliph. And there were many, many caliphs after Abu Bakr. The caliphate actually lasted until the early 1900s. It was after World War I that the caliphate came to an end. So starting with Abu Bakr and ending after World War I think it was 1922 that the caliphate was ended, there was always a caliph. The first few caliphs, Abu Bakr and the several that came after him, were called the rightly guided caliphs, were very powerful. They were sort of de facto rulers of the Muslim empire. But as the empire grew and more people were converting to Islam, the role ceased to have as much power. Kind of ironically, as the Muslim empire grew, the caliph had less and less power because the Muslim community was just so diverse and so large that it became more of a symbolic position. Especially as Muslims, there began to be Muslims in different lands, different empires, different countries. It became less and less an actual political leader and more sort of a symbolic figurehead of the Ummah, or the worldwide Muslim community. Within a short period of time, the caliph became more of this symbolic position. And that's why when the caliphate was ended in the early 1900s, it was not that controversial. It ended after the dissolving of the last Muslim empire, which was the Ottoman Empire. The caliphate was centered in Istanbul in Turkey at the time, because that was the center of the Ottoman Empire. And the leader who took over Turkey after World War I, a man named Ataturk, wanted to make Turkey a secular country, and he declared that the time of the caliph had just come to an end. It was no longer needed, it was no longer appropriate, because Muslims lived all over the world in many different countries and cultures, and they had their own political leaders. So there was just no need for a caliph anymore. So today there is no more caliph. There has not been a caliph since 1922. Sometimes you may hear of some sort of very extremist fringe groups like ISIS calling for the return of the caliphate and actually declaring someone the caliph. But this is something that they are, doing completely on their own, and no one really cares that they've decided there's another caliph, because there's not. In actuality, there is not another caliph, and there hasn't been since that time. So that was the political leader, and that's what the caliph was, but it's not around anymore. And then for Sunni Muslims, they do have a religious leadership role, which is known as the imam. And a Sunni imam is somebody who is akin to a priest, a minister, a rabbi. It's a local religious leader. So it is somebody who is Muslim and wants to have a role of leadership and spiritual guidance in that tradition. So to become an imam, usually it's somebody of great devotion, somebody who is a very devout Muslim. Only men can be imams. They would usually go to some sort of training. They would go to an Islamic university to learn about the Quran, about Arabic, Islamic history, traditions, interpretation, all that sort of stuff. And then they would most likely either run a mosque or they could teach at an Islamic university. So it's somebody who has sort of a local leadership, local religious leadership position. Not all mosques have an imam, but imams usually run the mosque. That's their full-time job. They run the educational programs there, maintaining the building, delivering speeches or teachings on Friday afternoons. So they have many different roles in sort of running the mosque, the educational as well as worship programs there. So it's important to know that that's what an imam is in Sunni Islam, because as we'll see, Shias also have a role of an imam, but they mean something very different by it. So that's kind of the idea of Sunni Islam, is separating those two roles, separating political leadership and religious leadership. The political role is no longer around, but the religious leadership role is still very much a part of Sunni Islam. And then we have Shias. So also important to note, when this split happened, the vast majority of Muslims became Sunni. And that majority-minority status is still around today. So about 85% of Muslims in the world are Sunni. So Shia has always been and still is a minority position within Islam. And that minority status, coupled with the history of persecution of Shias, is very important to Shia identity and helps to understand some of the sectarian violence that has gone on in recent times in some countries. So remember, Shias supported Ali. They did not support Abu Bakr to become Muhammad's successor. But Abu Bakr did become the first caliph, right? Because the majority of people in the Muslim community did support Abu Bakr. So Shia Islam, you could say from the beginning, it was a breakaway group. They disagreed with having Abu Bakr as the first leader, and they supported Ali, so they broke away from the majority or mainstream community. They believed that only Ali could be the leader, because Ali was the closest thing Muhammad had to a son. It was his son-in-law. And remember, Muhammad had a couple of sons, but they died in infancy. So he only had daughters that lived to adulthood. And it was also Muhammad's cousin. So it was a blood relative of Muhammad. And that's very important. So Shia Muslims also have an imam role. So there are imams within Shia Islam, but they believe that the imam is only somebody who can only be somebody who's related to Muhammad, so it has to be a blood relative of Muhammad. And instead of being chosen by the consensus of the community, in Shia Islam, imams are chosen by their predecessor. So the previous leader or imam chooses who the next imam is going to be. So, whereas for Sunni Muslims, Abu Bakr was their first caliph, for Shia Muslims, Ali was the first imam. So they have different titles for those roles. But they call their leader an imam. And important to note, in Shia Islam, they did not separate out political and religious leadership. They believed that the best way to honor Muhammad was to continue his example, right? That because Muhammad combined those two leadership roles, the leaders or imams after Muhammad should also combine those roles. For Shias, Ali was both their religious and political or social leader, just like Muhammad was before him. And Shias do actually believe that Muhammad did name a successor. They believe that Muhammad did say that Ali should be the next leader, even though Sunni Muslims disagree with that. And it comes from the hadith, from the disputed books between different groups of Muslims, of which hadiths are authoritative. But so anyways, Ali is the first imam for Shias. And then they believe that Ali chose the next imam, who chose the next imam, and et cetera, et cetera. But these imams, as you can see, they hold a different type of position than a Sunni imam. There are many, many Sunni imams, right? They work at a local mosque. They may teach at an Islamic university. But for Shias, an imam is something very special. An imam is somebody who is related to the prophet, chosen by their predecessor, and has sort of an innate holiness. Because of their connection to Muhammad, because they were chosen by the predecessor, they are seen in a much higher authority than Sunnis hold their imams. And really, the imam for Shia Muslims is sort of like God's intercessor on earth. It's somebody that you don't just respect, but you're devoted to. And they have a high degree of authority to have teachings. They're not a prophet per se, like Muhammad was, but they do have a large degree of authority to make teachings for all Muslims, to declare things to be true or untrue, etc. They sort of hold a position similar to the Pope in Catholicism, that it's someone that Catholics don't worship the Pope, but they have a very, very high degree of respect and devotion to, because he's seen as a holy individual, somehow closer to the teachings and an understanding of God than everyone else, and people look to him for his guidance in those matters. So I'll skip the massacre for a second, and I'll come back to that, just to kind of talk about the lineage of imams for a second more. So Ali, again, was the first imam. He designated the next imam. But it's important to note there is no Shia imam today. It's not a lineage that continued indefinitely. It only continued for about 200 years. There are a couple different denominations within Shia, but the largest by far is what's called Twelver Shiism, or Twelver Shias, and that's the term that I have down here. Iran is the only Shia country in the world, and it's Twelver. So Iran is officially a Twelver Shia country. So Twelvers, as they're sometimes called, believe that there were 12 imams. So starting with Ali, there were 12 of them. So down the line, and again, that lineage only lasted about 200 years, because not only is Shia Islam a minority, as I mentioned, it's a persecuted minority. And in its early days, it was seen as heretical, as a fringe group, a breakaway, unorthodox. So many of the imams were attacked. They had assassination attempts made on them, and many of them were actually killed, were assassinated by Sunnis, because they believed, again, that this was heretical. This was going against the teachings of Islam. So what happened was, many of the imams, either there were attempts on their lives or they were killed. So 12 imams only lasted about 200 years because many of them were killed. So the 12th imam, what happened was there was an attempt on his life. There was an assassination attempt made on him, but Shias believe that he did not die. He was not killed in that assassination attempt, but a short time afterwards, he sort of disappeared. The language that's usually used around it is that he became hidden from history or veiled from history. Basically, that God decided to protect him. Because he was being attacked and people were trying to kill him, that God sort of took him out of history and is protecting him. So the 12th Imam is not dead, he's still alive, but he exists in some sort of alternate plane or dimension, or is with God right now, and that he will return at a future point. So they believe that the Imam in some way is still accessible, because he's still alive, he's still around, and they await his return. So the 12th Imam is expected to return by 12er Shias. They believe that at some future point in time, when things are going very badly for the Shias, there's a lot of persecution, that the 12th Imam, what's known as the Mahdi, will return and will sort of, right all the wrongs that have been done to the Shia community. They believe that the return of the Mahdi is going to be one of the signs that the end of days or the day of judgment is coming soon. So Shia Muslims are expecting the return of the 12th Imam. And again, 12er Shias, the vast majority of Shias in the world. Prothero mentions one other sect of Shiism. Basically, some of them split off in terms of agreeing on the lineage of Imams, but you really just need to know about the 12ers. The last incident that I have here is the massacre at Karbala, which is a very important historical event for Shias. They really view it as the most tragic event that has ever happened in the history of the Muslim tradition. So it goes back to the very beginning of Shia Islam after the split from the Sunnis. Ali was the first Imam, and then his son, a man named Hussein, was the second Imam. So he designated his son, Hussein, to be the second Imam. So Hussein is Ali's son, and it's Muhammad's grandson, right? Because remember, Ali is his son-in-law. So Hussein was the grandson of the Prophet. And what happened was he was the Imam, and basically by that point in time, there were sort of two major Muslim empires that were centered in Arabia and centered in Iraq. And the empire that was centered in Iraq basically made a gesture to Hussein and wrote him a letter saying that the leader of the empire in Iraq wanted to support Hussein to become the next caliph. That he said, this split in the Muslim community, it's really tragic. We should all kind of come back together. And I think if you were the next caliph, everyone really, respects you because you're Muhammad's grandson. If you became the next caliph, then it would be able to unite the Muslim community again, and this Sunni-Shia split would be over. So Hussein, was very flattered and honored, and he agreed with this. So he said that he would accept the support of this dynasty. So basically, they invited him to come to Baghdad, where he would, receive the support of this community. They would support him for the next caliph, and then hopefully that would lead to him becoming the next caliph. So he sets off. He travels with his family and many other Shias. They're traveling from Arabia to Iraq. It turns out it was a trick. It was a trap. The leader of that dynasty actually just wanted to kill Hussein so that he could become the next caliph and there wouldn't be a rival to his authority. So what happens in a town called Karbala, which is in present-day Iraq, Hussein and his entourage were surrounded, and they were ambushed, and they were massacred. So virtually everyone in the group was killed, including Hussein. So this is an incredibly tragic event for Shia Muslims because the grandson of the Prophet was murdered, and along with his entire family and entourage. So it's of course a tragic event for all Muslims because it's the grandson of the Prophet who was killed, but for Shias it's especially important. And actually Shias have their own pilgrimage in addition to Hajj, which is that they go to Karbala once a year to commemorate this event, this massacre, and it's the second largest pilgrimage in the world after the Hajj. So it's honored each year, it's remembered each year, and it's an incredibly important event that helps to shape Shia identity as having a minority status within Islam, and that there is this history of persecution from Sunnis. So that's very important for Shia identity, although that is changing in many places in the Middle East because many places now have a Shia majority. So there's been a shift in politics and some of the dynamics that work within these countries. Okay, so that's a little bit more on Sunni and Shia Islam, and that's all we're going to talk about for this slide.